So let's go through some of the anatomy and physiology related to traumatic brain injuries. So momentum from physics is going to actually play a big role in this. It's very relevant to understanding the mechanisms of head injuries because head injuries often involve shearing forces. And that's because of acceleration, deceleration forces that create movement inside the skull. So, because there are different structures in the brain or in the cranium that have different masses, the momentum is unequal. And so, as one part is moving in one direction, another structure might move in a different direction or might still be moving in the opposite direction before it bounces back. And so, and this makes sense if you understand that momentum equals mass times velocity. So something that weighs more and is more dense, even if they're moving at the same pace, the momentum is going to be different. And it's that acceleration or momentum that really plays a big role in these injuries. Also, because the brain is soft, it deforms as it moves, which puts additional force on structures as they stretch. And we'll see a picture of this in just a minute. Furthermore, the brain sits in a pool of CSF and then it rotates within the skull. So a lot of these head injuries are really complex because it makes the brain and different parts of the brain move in all of these different directions. And so here's just a visual of that. So the head is in motion. The object and the head are in motion towards each other, right? And then there's an impact. And then the brain kind of squishes up against the skull. And then there's a rebound. It goes backwards. And so this mechanism is called a coup contre coup. And so oftentimes if there is a big injury and you have this like contusion on the brain, you'll often have it on the opposite side of the impact too. And then here's an impact from the side. And there you see like this is a top-down view. So there's some rotation within the brain. And then if we zoom in to the gray and white matter border, so that's what you're seeing over here, and you're just zooming into a little piece, you can see the neuron cell bodies and then these axons. And the axons are what your white matter is. And so these have a different mass, and they might be going into two different directions. And so you have this phenomenon occurring at the organ level and then the tissue level, but also like the cellular level where you have shearing forces. So let's talk a little bit, just keep it basic. Your brain is in this bowl of fluid, right? And then after your skull bones fuse, which is like, in infancy, when you're a toddler, then this is just this hard container, right? Your brain can't go anywhere. And so what does that mean? There's only one opening right here, the foramen magnum, where your brain can go if there is an excess in pressure. And so remember, going back to like biological mechanisms, when we talk about inflammation, we also talk about swelling and edema, and that happens in your brain too. Or if we're talking about cancer, that is an extra mass, and that has to push this somewhere. And so then it just pushes down. But this is really dangerous because this is the part of your brain that regulates your respiration and your heart rate. And so if this gets squished right here, you can die because it is affecting, your brainstem. So if there is a process after your brain bones are fused that it involves an excess in pressure, oftentimes they'll just drill holes in the skull to alleviate some of that pressure. But the thing that I want you guys to know is that, structure reflects function, right? But it also plays a role in dysfunction. And so because this structure is like a rigid boundary, any kind of excess fluid, excess pressure, excess mass within the skull is going to potentially be deadly. All right, so cerebral contusion. A contusion is just a bruise. A 27-year-old man who was punched in the face and fell backwards, striking the back of his head on the ground. Autopsy demonstrated the fracture at the occipital bone and extensive coup contre coup contusions over the frontal and temporal lobes. So occipital impact, because obviously there's a fracture, and remember that is the back of your head. And then extensive coup contre coup contusions or contre coup contusions over the frontal and temporal lobes. So the question for this one is, why does he have contusions on the front of his brain, which is up here, and here's, this is like looking at his brain from the bottom. Here's his cerebellum, here's his temporal lobes, here's his frontal lobe, and you see all this blood. So why does he have blood and up here whenever the fracture was back here? And so I'll let you guys play this on your own, but it's because of the way that the brain wiggles, right? Maybe I'll just play it a little bit. All right, so you also have the veins that bridge from your brain to your skull, and they do this by bridging through the meninges. So you do have this space in between, you know, here's your brain, and there's a couple of different spaces between this and the skull. And some of these are spaces that contain cerebral spinal fluid. Some of these are spaces that actually are fused together unless there is a bleed. But the thing to remember with this is that these vessels right here can also shear. So we saw the picture of the different masses in your brain, how it wiggles at the organ level, how it can shear at the axonal level, but it can also shear some of these vessels that are in your skull. And here is an example of how that can happen. So a 9-month-old presents with bruises on her face and blindness. A review of her medical records showed that she had normal vision at her 2-month visit. Her mother is currently hospitalized for psychosis. This white part that's lighting up at the back, that is blood. And this very, very, very white part, that is skull. And then you see the brain right here. So there's a space right here, and it kind of just like hugs the brain. And this is a subdural hematoma. So subdural right here, epidural right here. So underneath the meninges that cover your brain and spinal cord, and on top of them. Now the bleeding with either one of these is going to be different, because a subdural hematoma or hemorrhage is going to involve venous blood, and an epidural is going to involve arterial blood. And you can remember that arterial blood is a lot more like forceful, there's a lot more pressure, that's what comes straight out of your heart. So if you have an epidural hemorrhage, it's going to be massive and fast. A subdural hemorrhage can kind of ooze for a while, and that's where you get this kind of settling. So it doesn't have as dramatic of an effect, but eventually, because there's so much pressure, it will cause issues. And I'll let you look at this, but here you can just see how this vein has sheared. Now we usually see this in young children when they're like shaken or jolted, and then we see this in older people when they fall, because there is usually some shrinkage of the brain, and so the vessel has to go through that space a little bit longer. And here you can see they've taken out the brain, but they've left the meninges or the dura, and you can see how these veins travel in this area, and so any of these can like shear off from some of these forces. A 25-year-old man was struck by a baseball on the right side of his head. 4 hours later, he became lethargic, vomited, and developed a left hemiparesis. Now you see a major, whitish mass right here, and it's so major that it's kind of distorting the brain structure. So here's a ventricle where you have CSF fluid, and you don't really see it on this side because it's causing so much pressure. And so something like this is really associated with an epidural bleed, and you can even see some swelling of the soft tissue right here. And just to orient you again, here's like where his face would be, and here's the back of the head. So we talked about the subdural bleeds being from venous drainage, and that's going to be either due to shaking or a fall if you're elderly. And you're not going to, you might gradually develop symptoms. An epidural, because it is arterial, this is going to kill you pretty quick. Like, it gets bad very fast. And it might not do it right away, but, within hours, it's a serious situation. And this is usually associated with a fracture. So anytime you hear a bone fracture, that's usually going to be an epidural hematoma. And here's why. It's because the arteries travel right along the bones. So we saw that the dura kind of travels through the meninges in that sheath, but the arteries just hug the bone. And so if you fracture the bone, particularly at your temple, you're going to just, fracture this artery. Let you guys look at that on your own. Some review, we're going to zoom in even more. So this is a synapse, and remember, this is how neurons communicate. So, and this is an electron microscope of a synapse releasing neurotransmitters from these little vesicles. Pretty cool. And then this is inside the axon, and I'll let you guys look at this, but remember that you have these microtubules going inside, as part of the cytoskeleton. So we're zoomed in very, very far. This is like a illustration that's modeled off of like electron microscope. So we're super deep into the cell now, and then this is that vesicle that is holding the neurotransmitter. So here's the synapse where it's released, but remember, it has to go from here all the way down here and then be released right here. And so how does it travel? It doesn't show that in this illustration, but in this video, it shows it traveling almost like a train track down these microtubules. And this is going to be an important concept because these microtubules are held together by something called a tau. So think of tau as the glue, and it's not a big deal unless you rupture this. So I'll let you look at this by yourself. And this is just an overview of what we've already talked about, but it's specific for football. So even though you have this helmet on, when you have a blow to the head, the helmet is not going to protect your brain because the brain is already protected by your skull. And as you have this impact, the brain still has an impact on the skull and then bounces back, right? So there's that coup contre coup. And so that's why we see so many issues with, particularly with contact sports. And then to finish off, I will let you watch that.